On a warm July evening, newlyweds Claire and Jason arrived at a luxurious seaside resort in Mauritius. It was the start of their honeymoon, a trip Claire had dreamed of for years. Claire, an elementary school teacher, was excited for this idyllic escape. Jason, a successful businessman, appeared every bit the charming and attentive husband. But beneath his charming facade lay a man with chilling depths. Jason was a sociopath. The couple's first few days seemed perfect on the surface: long walks on the beach, candlelit dinners, and hours by the pool. Yet, to the resort staff, something seemed off. Jason's smile was too controlled, his compliments too rehearsed, and while Claire seemed to radiate happiness, moments of unease crossed her face when she thought no one was watching. On the 5th day of their stay, Jason suggested a boat trip to a nearby island. Claire eagerly agreed, her love for adventure fueling her excitement. They left early in the morning, just the two of them on a private yacht Jason had rented. As the boat sliced through the crystal blue waters, Jason kept his eyes fixed ahead, barely engaging in conversation. Claire, sensing the mood shift, tried to lighten the atmosphere, but Jason remained distant. When they arrived at the island, Jason led Claire to a secluded cove, far from the bustling tourist spots. The place was beautiful, almost surreal in its tranquility. They spent the morning snorkeling and exploring the shore, but as the afternoon heat intensified, Jason became increasingly cold. His responses to Claire's questions grew shorter, his affection completely absent. Suddenly, Jason suggested they hike up a nearby cliff for a better view. Claire hesitated. She was already feeling fatigued, but Jason insisted, his tone leaving little room for argument. Reluctantly, she followed him. The hike was steeper than Claire had anticipated, and she grew nervous as they neared the cliff's edge. She stopped, peering down at the jagged rocks below. "Jason, I don't think we should get too close," she said, her voice shaking slightly. Jason smiled, but it wasn't the warm, reassuring smile she knew. It was cold, calculating. "You're fine, Claire. Come closer," he said, extending his hand. The hairs on the back of Claire's neck stood up. Something was very wrong. "I'm going back," Claire said, turning to leave, but Jason's grip on her arm tightened. "Claire," he whispered, his voice unervingly calm, "you always wanted freedom, didn't you? To escape the mundane, the ordinary life. Here's your chance." His hand, still gripping her arm, began to pull her closer to the edge. Fear surged through Claire as she realized the gravity of the situation. "Jason, stop," she screamed, struggling against his grip. But Jason's strength, fueled by years of cold detachment, was overwhelming. He moved with terrifying precision, his sociopathic nature fully revealed. In a frantic struggle, Claire managed to break free, falling to the ground as she scrambled away from the cliff's edge. Jason loomed over her, a look of irritation flashing across his face. "You never understood, did you?" he said, his voice low and menacing. "I thought you were different, but in the end, you're just like everyone else. Weak." Trembling, Claire stood up, her heart pounding as she realized the full extent of Jason's plan. He hadn't brought her here for a romantic hike. He'd brought her to end her life. Desperate, Claire turned and ran, adrenaline surging through her veins. She didn't look back, didn't dare slow down until she reached the safety of the beach. Gasping for breath, she spotted the boat still anchored in the distance. Without wasting a second, she jumped into the water, swimming furiously towards the yacht. Jason didn't follow. He stood at the top of the cliff, watching her with those same cold eyes, already calculating his next move. By the time Claire reached the boat and flagged down a passing vessel, Jason had vanished. He returned to the mainland later that evening, alone, telling the resort staff that Claire had decided to stay on the island for a few extra hours. Claire was never found. Jason returned home a widower, his sociopathic charm hiding the truth of what had transpired. But Claire had survived. Weeks later, she emerged from a remote village, battered and traumatized but alive, ready to tell her story of the husband who had tried to vanish her forever. Claire's miraculous survival shocked everyone, but the nightmare wasn't over. When she was discovered in the small fishing village, she was in a fragile state, physically exhausted, sunburned, and emotionally shattered. The villagers had taken care of her, but Claire had been too terrified to speak, fearing that Jason might somehow find her and finish what he had started. Once Claire was stable, she was flown back home, her story still a closely guarded secret. Jason, meanwhile, had returned to their quiet suburban life, acting the role of the grieving husband. He had held a memorial for Claire, mourning her tragic disappearance on their honeymoon. His charm and sorrow won over friends and family, all of whom believed his carefully constructed narrative. But Claire was not ready to be erased. As soon as she stepped off the plane, she contacted the police and, accompanied by her lawyer, provided a detailed account of Jason's attempt on her life. The detectives were skeptical at first, especially given Jason's reputation, a well-respected, successful man with no prior signs of instability. But Claire was determined to bring him down. She knew Jason better than anyone. She understood his cunning mind, the meticulous way he manipulated others to hide his true nature. The police launched a quiet investigation. They had to move carefully, knowing Jason would catch on to any sudden shifts in attention. Claire's disappearance had been reported, and Jason had woven a perfect story around it. No one had questioned his version of events, and no physical evidence tied him to any crime, yet. Claire, however, had survived by learning to think like him. She had been married to Jason for 2 years, and in that time, she had noticed small, unsettling things, a distant coldness in his gaze, the way he could lie without flinching, his unsettling lack of empathy. But it wasn't until the honeymoon that she truly understood the depth of his psychopathy. She knew that to bring him down, she would need to be as calculated and ruthless as he was. The investigation began with the smallest details: bank statements, emails, and phone records from the day of Claire's disappearance. Jason had been careful, but not flawless. A few discrepancies appeared: a last-minute change in their yacht booking, an anonymous payment for additional life insurance on Claire just before the honeymoon, and an email from Jason's private account to an unknown recipient the day after Claire vanished. With this information, the detectives brought Jason in for questioning. He didn't falter under pressure. His performance was impeccable, calm, composed, and concerned for his missing wife. He answered every question with the ease of someone confident in his own lies. But Claire knew this was just the beginning. Jason had always underestimated her, seeing her as a piece of his perfect life, an accessory rather than an equal. This time, she would turn the tables. As the investigation deepened, Claire stayed hidden, only communicating with law enforcement through her lawyer. Jason, believing her dead, had begun to relax. His public grief started to give way to his old life: parties, work, and a budding relationship with another woman. But Claire was always one step ahead. When the detectives gathered enough circumstantial evidence, they decided it was time to strike. Claire, against her lawyer's advice, insisted on being there. She wanted to see Jason's face when he realized she was alive. The confrontation took place at Jason's office. It was early morning, and he had just arrived, looking every bit the successful executive he had always been. As he sat down to review his schedule, the detectives walked in, followed by Claire. Jason froze. For a split second, his face registered shock, a crack in his carefully constructed facade. But just as quickly he recovered, his expression transforming into one of surprise and disbelief. "Claire." His voice was steady, but the sharp glint in his eyes betrayed his true feelings. What happened to you?" Claire stepped forward, her heart pounding but her voice calm. "You left me to die, Jason. But I survived." The tension in the room was electric. The detectives moved in closer, their eyes trained on Jason, waiting for him to slip. Jason, realizing the game was up, leaned back in his chair and smirked, the charming mask finally falling away. "You should have stayed dead," he said quietly, his voice devoid of emotion. The detectives immediately arrested Jason, charging him with attempted murder. But Claire knew this wasn't the end. Jason would fight the charges, and his manipulative nature would make the trial a public spectacle. He would paint Claire as unstable, desperate for attention, and try to turn the narrative against her. But this time, Claire was ready. She had escaped his grasp once and now had the strength and resolve to expose him for what he truly was: a sociopath willing to kill to maintain control. And this time, Jason Henderson would not walk away unscathed. The trial of Jason Henderson captivated the nation. Claire, once the loving wife, now stood as the brave survivor who had escaped a deadly trap set by a man she once thought she knew. The courtroom was packed with reporters, eager to document every twist in the case. Jason, ever the charmer, arrived each day in a perfectly tailored suit, his face an unreadable mask of calm. But behind his cool demeanor, there was a storm brewing, a storm of desperation. From the start, the prosecution was relentless. They painted Jason as a cold-blooded sociopath who had meticulously planned his wife's death. They presented the damning evidence: the suspicious life insurance policy, the inconsistent details in his story, and, most chillingly, Claire's testimony. The jury sat enraptured as Claire recounted every moment of terror on that cliff, the look in Jason's eyes, the way he had calmly tried to push her over the edge. But Jason's defense was equally calculated. His lawyer, a slick attorney with a reputation for defending the wealthy, argued that Claire had fabricated the entire story. He suggested she had suffered from mental health issues, exacerbated by the pressures of marriage. Jason, they claimed, had been nothing but a loving husband, devastated by her disappearance. They presented their own witnesses, friends, colleagues, even the resort staff who had seen Jason mourn her absence. For weeks, the trial dragged on, each side fighting for control of the narrative. But through it all, Claire remained strong. She sat in the witness stand with a quiet dignity, recounting the horrors she had endured. Jason's lawyer tried to break her, probing her with questions meant to discredit her, to paint her as unhinged or desperate for attention. But Claire never wavered. The turning point came when the prosecution called a surprise witness, a private investigator who had dug into Jason's past. The investigator revealed a series of disturbing details. Jason had a history of manipulating those closest to him, several ex-girlfriends had come forward with stories of emotional abuse, and there were even rumors of a previous wife who had mysteriously disappeared years ago, though no charges had ever been filed. Jason's composure began to crack. On the final day of the trial, Jason made the decision to take the stand. It was a gamble, one his lawyer had advised against, but Jason believed his charm could sway the jury. He played the role of the devoted husband once more, speaking of his deep love for Claire and his heartbreak over her disappearance. But as the prosecutor began cross-examination, the carefully constructed mask began to slip. "Mr. Henderson," the prosecutor began, "did you not take out a life insurance policy on your wife just days before your honeymoon?" Jason hesitated, but answered, "It was a precaution. Claire and I discussed it. And you claim you had no intention of harming her, despite the fact that she's here today, alive, telling us you tried to kill her?" Jason's calm faltered. "I would never hurt Claire. She's confused." The prosecutor stepped closer, her voice sharp. "Confused? Or did she simply escape before you could finish the job?" Jason's jaw tightened. For a moment, there was silence. Then, in a moment of frustration, he snapped. "She was supposed to fall." The courtroom gasped. The silence that followed was deafening. Jason's face drained of color as he realized what he had just said. His lawyer buried his face in his hands. Claire sat perfectly still, the weight of Jason's words crashing over her. She had known deep down that this moment would come, but hearing the truth spill from his lips brought both closure and a fresh wave of pain. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. When they returned, the foreperson stood, her voice steady as she read the verdict. Guilty of attempted murder. Jason Henderson was sentenced to life in prison, with no chance of parole. The media frenzy continued for days, but Claire stayed far from the cameras. She had no desire for fame or pity. All she wanted was peace, and to reclaim the life Jason had tried to steal from her. In the months that followed, Claire slowly rebuilt her life. The shadows of what had happened lingered, but they no longer defined her. She was a survivor, no longer afraid. Jason had been a master manipulator, but in the end, he had underestimated Claire's will to live. As she stood on the beach one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Claire felt a sense of calm she hadn't known in years. She had been to the edge of darkness and survived. And now, finally, she was free.